You can change your location, meet new people, and still have the same old problems. To truly change your life, you need to look inward, get to know and love yourself, and heal the trauma and dense conditioning in your mind. This is how you get to the root. Internal changes have a significant external impact. That was a quote from Yung Pueblo's book, Clarity and Connection, which was one of my favorite reads from last year. And I remember reading that passage and connecting it to the experience and journey of a coach. In the book Inside Out Coaching by Joe Ehrman, he encourages coaches to start by understanding how we were coached, because that influences how we go on to coach. I want to build off of what Ehrman shares there. Not only do we need to understand our own experiences as a player, both the highs and lows and potentially the traumas, but we need to understand our experiences as a coach, both the highs and lows and the potential traumas. If we fail to heal, we end up carrying those traumas forward and we continue to hurt ourselves and others. Welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you are new, my name is JP Nurbin. I'm the founder of TOC, which provides coaching for coaches, as well as practical strategies and tools for coaches to use to build their culture and grow as a leader. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Nate Sanderson. If you want to learn more about TOC, head on over to tocculture.com. There you will find a lot of our resources, as well as you can sign up for our weekly newsletter to get the notes to this and every episode of the podcast. Don't forget to check out my latest book, The Culture System. Many are calling it the most practical and applicable book on coaching and culture they've ever come across.
A couple of months ago, JP, at the start of our season, I wrote an article for the newsletter talking a little bit about our first week and some of the, I don't know if drama is the right word, but some anxiety-provoking events that happened during the first few days of our season. So we went into the start of practice expecting to have about 22, 23 kids out for basketball. And by the end of the first week, we landed on the number 16. So we canceled our fresh soft schedule. We lost the majority of our freshman sophomore team, not all at one time, typically one on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday. It was a slow bleed from 22 down to 16 over the course of about 10 days. And for me, that triggered a lot of emotions that were a little bit unexpected. So first of all, when you lose players and you have attrition like that, it's at the start of the year. It feels a little bit public. Everybody knows that, when the schedule gets canceled, that something's gone on. It feels embarrassing, right? There's a little bit of like, geez, do I really know what I'm doing here? Did I do something to provoke this? Is this my fault? I think that's normal, and I think that's natural. What was different for me is that I found myself compulsively checking my email by the end of the week. Not because I was expecting something from another player that had changed their mind and decided to go on and do something else with their time, but because I was searching for the next parent email that was going to land blast me and make this my fault and come after me because we were losing kids. And I started to think a little bit about, why am I constantly clicking on my inbox and searching for this email and on high alert for a message from my AD? And quite frankly, what I discovered sort of in this reflection is that a lot of this stemmed from what I went through before at Linmar, and my brain was starting to react to what it perceived to be some similar patterns of behavior that led to a disaster 3 years ago. And in a sense, it was starting to prepare itself for that same thing to happen again, unbeknownst to me, sort of in my subconscious. And so we've titled this episode PTSD in Coaching, not just to sort of have a live therapy session for myself here, but because I think there's lots of times, JP, where coaches go through things, and then years later, when those patterns start to emerge again, we react in ways that we don't necessarily expect, that can make our coaching much more complicated if we don't recognize what the brain is actually doing in response to those triggers.
Yeah, Nate, I spend about 20 hours a week talking with coaches in their season, listening to what's going on, not just within their team, but what's going on within themselves. And so I've seen this very similar thing happen in others. I've seen it in myself, whether, like you said there, you've had that experience of, a bit of an uprising with parents and getting fired, or, Other coaches, they've had administrators that don't support them, or they've gotten those parent emails that then trigger, a couple months of dissent and disconnect between the team. We've had players quitting. We've had assistant coaches that might stab a coach in the back. Or you just start to hear gossiping, right? Or there's the social media post. All of these things that can happen in coaching that are somewhat traumatic for us, right? As events, they are highly stressful events. We lose sleep, not just one night, but multiple nights. We go potentially even a whole season without sleeping well. And it infects every aspect of our life. It impacts our family. It impacts other relationships. And we seem to have moved past that, right? We feel like we've moved past that, but we haven't, because then the next time, it could be a completely new administrator. We could have a completely new team, completely new parents. We could be in a completely new community, a new environment, but yet we bring those experiences with us and we allow it to break down trust, in some of these new relationships that we're trying to build. So what I mean by that is all of a sudden, one player reacts or handles a situation in a way that maybe a past player had, and all of a sudden triggers back, well, here we go. This person's going to be totally disconnected. We can, count on them, getting nothing out of them this season, or they're going to be a culture killer, or they're going to be a problem. Or we do the same with parents. A parent wants to meet with us. Here we go again, right? This parent's going to be the problem. And we allow that to impact us negatively in how we view other people.
Well, JP, there's no doubt that there's all kinds of different episodes that can leave a scar, right? And I think that's what we're really trying to focus on here in this conversation. Is it's not just the everyday usual stressors of the coaching experience. We're not talking about the pressure to win or trying to solve the playing time problem, or what kids go on what team, or whatever, those things that happen year in and year out that are inherent to the job. We're really talking about trauma here, and we've visited this topic on our retreats, and we've talked about this with Dr. Bruce Perry and others on the podcast. But I think it's informative to really understand what is the difference, what is the effect of the scar on how we perceive things that are happening in the present based on what we've experienced in the past. So one of the ways that we explained this at our last coaching retreat is that if you imagine a traumatic experience here, we're talking about something that causes you physical or emotional pain, like severe pain. I think it's easiest to understand how the brain responds to that if you think of it sort of an exaggerated situation. So imagine, if you will, we used a picture at the retreat of like a college professor's disorganized office. If you can imagine kind of a small office room with a computer, and there's a desk, and there's papers, and there's books just piled all over the place, and this old brown carpet, and it looks kind of like a musty room a little bit. It's going to have the smell of old books in it. If you can imagine a young child going in as dad is working as a professor here, and he's getting caught up on his grading, whatever he has to get done, feeling the academic pressures, and the kid comes in and starts bothering him and pestering him, and eventually he snaps, and he slaps the kid around a little bit and kicks him out of the room, like physically does something painful to the child, throws him out of the room, slams the door, right? 4 or 5-year-old kid comes out of that room. The brain is going to immediately take a snapshot of that environment because it recognizes, holy shit, that really hurt physically, emotionally. This person that I really trusted all of a sudden is yelling and screaming at me and hurting me. The brain is going to go into this mode of, we can't ever let this happen again. This hurt too much. And so in this snapshot at 4 years old, 5 years old, it takes a picture of the room. And it stores it in a place in the brainstem where every experience going forward is going to be compared to this image, just in case they see something that could be similar, so that if so, the brain starts to then trigger your defense response. It starts to make you alert, put you on awareness here that we could be entering danger if we see another room that's got a bunch of books scattered all over the place and disorganized. Or if we come across the smell of that musty office, might be as a 12-year-old visiting their teacher, it might be as an adult visiting their boss's office, and all of a sudden, for reasons that they can't understand, Their palms start to get sweaty. Their heart rate starts to go up. They start to feel tense. Their pupils dilate a little bit, and they're just sort of looking around, and they're not necessarily sure why, but there's a suspicion all of a sudden in the room because of an event that the brain stored in its memory 20 years ago as a 4 and 5-year-old interrupting their dad at work in his office. Now, when we think about an episode with a small child whose brain isn't developed well enough to process events like this, or something that involves emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, you might sit here and think, well, of course the brain is going to respond that way to something like that. That's incredibly traumatic for a child to experience. But the same mechanisms, the same defense systems continue to operate into adulthood for situations that cause us great pain or great discomfort. And that goes all the way back to what you just talked about there, JP, of we can have episodes where trust is broken and an assistant coach stabs us in the back, or a parent starts a rebellion, or an administrator, says, well, I'm hearing all these things, from these secret places about what a terrible coach you are, and we're going to have to make a change. And all of a sudden, the brain goes on alert and says, oh, no, we can't let this happen again. And so it takes a snapshot, right? And that snapshot then is compared to every other coaching situation that we go through following, whether we're aware of it or not.
And I remember even just in Dr. Perry's book, it was something as simple as like deodorant. Like one time, he walked in, he was wearing the deodorant that the patient associated with their abusive father, right? Like, and that became this trigger, and just incredibly fascinating stuff, what you're sharing about there about the brain. What I'm curious, Nate, is that, we're talking about, okay, these things become triggers. And obviously it causes us emotional distress as a coach, and it affects our well-being as a coach. How else does it impact you? Looking back, other than just being really stressed out during that time, did this have the potential to start affecting your decision-making as a coach?
Well, I think in my case, JP, it's important to understand sort of the chronology of events that happened at Linn-Mar in terms of what my brain was expecting to happen next after kids started leaving and doing other things here this fall when our season started. So that was the first complaint. When I eventually lost my job at Linn-Mar, was kids stopped going out. I remember there was a parent that assailed one of our assistant coaches in a classroom and said, what the hell is he doing that everybody wants to leave this program? Just coming right at us there because of the attrition factor. And then the AD follows that up and says, the most important thing is we got to keep kids out. So what are we doing wrong that kids want to leave? This was 3 years ago. And so then that led to, when players would come in to complain about whatever their issues were with the AD, that got piled on. And then that, in my mind, linked, now the AD is calling me in and now we have to justify everything in the program. And then 3 weeks later, I'm being asked to resign, right? So it looked like that this pattern was starting to develop again, beginning with players leaving. Then I get a text message at the end of the week from my AD that just wants to come in and chat about, trying to see if there's any patterns here, if there's anything that we can do better to try to keep kids from leaving. Perfectly innocuous reason to sit down and talk after a situation like this. Sent my anxiety through the roof because that was the next step, right? And what happened 3 years ago. And so then the way that it affected me in practice was that previously at Linn-Mar, part of the process was players would come in and complain to the AD anonymously, and then the AD would come back to me and say, here's what the players are complaining about, but I never knew who was saying what. So I became suspicious of all the players at Linn-Mar. I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know, who's just being nice to my face in practice and then is going behind my back to talk to the AD. And so all of those suspicions started flooding back, even in the midst of practice in Mount Vernon, with no reason whatsoever. I mean, no justification. That wasn't happening, not even close. But there was this suspicion of, are you being nice to me, just to my face, but are you complaining behind my back? Are you going to the AD? Are you complaining at home? Are your parents emailing the AD and I don't know it? Like, that type of suspicion came flooding in, and it made me, quite frankly, really uncomfortable around my players for a few days before I could really recognize what was causing me to feel that way or why my brain was reacting in that way.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things that are happening in your experience, as well as so many other coaches that I would talk with, Nate. And that is that, when we've had these really negative experiences, these things that have left scars, I still think we try to learn from them as coaches. And so we obviously try to go make adjustments and prevent something like this from happening again in the future. So here we are, we're learning, growing, and we're moving forward. But when we start to see similar events happen that might be a sign of us heading back down there, it can be like, oh no, like it becomes that thing that triggers. And I think when that happens, what follows often in coaches is that we start to coach not that we're leading with fear, but we start to coach out of fear. We coach afraid. We lose that confidence and conviction that we need to be an effective leader. And so other examples of this might be, you should be building relationships with families, whether you're at the college level or the high school level. Like, you need to be out there, you need to be connecting, you need to build relationships with those parents. But yet, because you had this event, you start to operate in a place of fear and just constant distrust. That doesn't help you. Or maybe you've challenged a player, you held a player accountable, and that player goes to the administration, and all of a sudden you're being blamed for damaging their mental and emotional health. And you're on this performance review and a meeting with administrators, and HR is coming in. Or maybe there's those instances where, you've dropped a player from the lineup, and all of a sudden I've seen a coach drop a player from the lineup, and all of a sudden the superintendent is coming in, right? And that's a traumatic event for that coach, right? So all of a sudden now he's thinking, I need to drop this player, but I'm worried because this kid's parent is on the board, and is this going to come back to me and the superintendent? And is my job going to be in jeopardy? These are all things that just really negatively impact us, and we start to lead out of fear and be ineffective.
Well, I think what's interesting about this whole process, JP, is that sometimes the signs that you're reacting to something are really subtle. So I can give you examples. One of the things that happened a lot at Linn-Mar after games is you'd have these little clusters of parents that would wait in the gym after every game, home and away, and the kids would go to their, parent groups or whatever. And I always felt like, especially after losses, that they were essentially saying that, look, it's the coach's fault. It's not your fault. You're doing the best with what he's doing, whatever. And because you get these glares, as you try to navigate through the commons area to get back to the office or whatever. And so now, 3 years later, in a totally supportive environment, whenever I see a couple clusters of parents talking after the game, I naturally find myself walking on the other side of the gym floor. I walk around it, right? Or when we lose and I got to go upstairs to talk to the media after the game, we do these little post-game interviews on our YouTube page. I don't make eye contact with anybody because I just feel the shame, and I feel like there's daggers because that's what happened before, and again, and sometimes there's even the whispers of the same criticism start echoing in your mind. So one of the things that happened at Linn-Mar before we got let go was that I was told the players don't want to talk to you. They don't talk to them on the bus. Don't do one-on-ones. Don't talk to a player on your own. And so now, as I'm seeing these, my brain is thinking these patterns are repeating themselves. I start to feel a lot of anxiety about even saddling up next to a kid in the bleacher and asking how the game went, because I think, do they even want to talk to me? I'm not even sure. I just feel super uncomfortable with something that should be totally natural given the environment that I'm currently in. And I think the whole point of what we're trying to describe here is to learn to recognize when your brain is reacting to some of the patterns that it's perceiving, so that you can begin to deal with them and respond to those in a way that prevents you from going farther down, the line, becoming more anxious, becoming more fearful, and all the things that you described just a minute ago.
So Nate, I want to kind of get into some of the solutions or ways we can kind of work through some of these things as a coach and as a leader. And one of the things that we often talk about with coaches is we got to do the inner work first, right? And I think sometimes people are wondering, well, what's this inner work, Well, it starts oftentimes with understanding our experiences. Not, sometimes, experiences in our life that would impact us as a coach. So, how we were coached impacts how we coach, but also understanding our timeline of coaching, the positive events, the monumental events that have shaped us as a coach. Those are really important, as well as we've talked about today, is some of these low points, and recognizing that oftentimes, and usually our stressful reactions as coaches, as leaders, they are just past experiences coming up. So we have to be reflective. We have to understand these potentially traumatic events in our history. And then we're on alert for when those things start to impose themselves upon our current situation. That's where I think we would start with. And I think you've clearly demonstrated you were self-aware, right? You were very self-aware in that moment that the past was coming up in your current present and impacting your thinking and your current emotional state. So then what was the next step for you?
Well, I think what was interesting about that, so at the end of the week, I get this text from the AD that wants me to come in and talk about just why kids are leaving. So I immediately go to the full on defense attorney mode, and I craft this email, and I go back to all 10 players that we had from the end of last year to the start of this year, or to the end of that first week, that were no longer out for basketball, and wrote what they told me. And in some cases, I just copied and pasted even the text exchanges of what the kids were saying in terms of why they weren't going out. And this is, part of the defense mechanism. And I was this way as a teacher too, is like, I'm trying to do everything possible to prove that it wasn't my fault. At the end of the day, right? And so he read that, and I came into the office on that afternoon, and he shut the door, and he's like, okay, I read through it, and we just talked, a little bit about, was there anything else, or was he hearing anything else? There was a couple other things that he had heard from talking to a couple players that were right in line, but just maybe added a little bit of color to some of the explanations that I was getting. But he could tell that I was not my usual self, that I was a little bit on edge. I was short with my answers. I was just a little tense or whatever. And so he asked me, he's like, well, how are you feeling about all of this? Because I know it changed your plans, it's changed your schedule, and, changed what you expected, obviously. And I just told him, I said, well, quite honestly, this brings back a lot of flashbacks for me, because the first complaint at Linmar was kids weren't going out, and then to be called into the AD's office, and get assailed a couple of different times with player complaints. I said, I was nervous about what was going to be the other side of seeing players leave. And he just immediately, and he's definitely a feeler, by nature, said, not my intention at all. In fact, Nate, I felt exactly the opposite. I was worried that you would be thinking, is Mount Vernon really the place that I want to be if we can't get kids to buy in and stay out? And that maybe you would be thinking about having your eyes somewhere else, because maybe this isn't the place that you can build what you want to build. In other words, he was afraid that I was going to leave because kids were leaving, and I was afraid he was going to ask me to leave because kids weren't staying out. And so once we got that out in the open, there was just sort of this breath of relief on both sides of the table, that we both had assumptions that were totally off. And I'm not sure where his were coming from, but I told him, I said, because he asked, he's like, what can we do to better, given your background and things that you've been through, like, are there things we can do to better support you as we go through the season? And I just said, one of the things that meant the most to me was I just had met with a player the day before in our pack lobby. And as I was walking back to the gym, I walked past the principal, and he had known that, a couple players weren't going out and stuff. And it's like, oh, how you doing? And I said, just hoping that this was the last one, and he just said, like, almost casually, kind of walking by, but he's like, well, we're just glad you're here, and we hope you're here for as long as you want to be here, and to me, that was like earth shattering when he said that, because it spoke right into the insecurity. And really, in a lot of ways, it like shattered the pattern recognition in my brain, because that's not what I heard when I really needed to, obviously, when things were going down at Linmar. So I shared that with my AD, and I just said, I can't tell you how much that meant. I don't even know if my principal remembers saying it, but it was the most impactful thing maybe that I've heard since I've been here. And he's like, no, that's how we feel. And we want you to, know that we're in your corner the whole way. And we're just trying to help you, continue to improve the program, which I think is what you want to. And obviously I said, yeah. And so, there's this great sort of closure to the meeting where I think my AD had a better understanding of just how damaged goods I am in some respects, given what I've been through. And it was important for me to understand that, they're still 100% behind what we're doing and believe in it and believe in me. And like I said, that really freed me then from a lot of the anxiety coming out of that meeting.
Yeah. And I think what you're really getting at, as far as a potential solution or a way to work through some of this stuff, is to share some of these traumatic experiences with people that it is appropriate to share it with. And I think there's a personal example from my own life, without going too deep into it. I was probably about 3-4 years into my marriage, and there would be something in a discussion / argument when my wife and I would argue, that she would do that just really triggered me. And it was probably a little bit for her confusing how this one way of arguing why it was triggering me so much. It was oftentimes kind of just being critical of my tone in a way that was kind of mocking, right? But it related back to experiences in my childhood that I still hold on to, with how I was criticized by certain individuals that have really left an imprint there. And I carried that into it. But when I shared with her, I was like, listen, when you do that, it reminds me of this. It was earth shattering for her. She's like, oh, I'm so sorry. That's not what I mean to be doing, And so as you move through forward in coaching, I think my encouragement for all of us is, if you've had an experience, maybe it is worthwhile to share with your players. Like, hey, if you want to quit, please come tell me, because I've had players quit in the past and this happened and it just, man, it was the worst experience. And I get this fear, I need to know from you. Like, it's okay. I'll support you. I'll work with you on it. But like, it might be appropriate to share that experience so it helps players understand why them, you hearing from somebody else that they're going to leave the team, like how that is so important to you. And it could be the same thing. Maybe you share something with parents, I think these things, or administrators, like in your case, it helps them to better understand you and how to work with you.
Well, that reminds me, JP, of another episode in Dr. Bruce Perry's book where he talked about incorporating a first grader who had gone through some pretty serious trauma in their home into a new classroom. And so the day before they introduced the kid to the class, middle of the school year, Dr. Perry and somebody else came in and they talked to the class about what Andre had gone through. And not in great detail, but just enough to understand that this was going to be harder than usual for someone coming into a new class. And so just having, their peers be aware of that when they brought Andre in the next day, people were fighting over each other to take him to his next class and sit by him at lunch and help him with his, backpack and things like that. And so it made this integration process incredibly comfortable for the new student because the rest of the class was sort of made aware of these unique circumstances. And I think that that's appropriate where it's appropriate. I'm not sure that I would tell my whole story at a parent meeting, to start the year at Mount Vernon. But when I can think of, I had a conversation after I wrote the article, I sent it to one of my captains just because we were talking about the brain a little bit. And I said, I wonder what you think about this. And so we talked about it a little bit and she didn't understand. She didn't get it. Right. And so I unpacked it a little bit more, 10, 15 minutes after practice. And she goes, oh, that's just really interesting how you recognize how the brain is working. And she said, I don't think anybody that's left, it's because of you. Like, I haven't heard that from anybody or anywhere, if that means anything to you. And again, it was just one of those things where that meant a lot to me. It was a pattern shattering comment, right? And it ground me again. It rebuilt my confidence a little bit that maybe I don't have to be as worried that this pattern is repeating itself now that I've heard from my administrators and from, one of my captains. Those I think were helpful for me to be able to share. So I think there is something to that. I think it also has to be in the right context and with the right people.
And what I think what that sharing does, even if it's sharing with close friends or people outside of your circumstance, the circumstances there, what it does is it allows other people to help ground us in reality. Because what we've allowed in that situation, in your example, is your perceptions, these things you're picking up on are sending triggers. And you're really, if you're having that stress response, you're not accessing really the upper cortex as much. You're not really thinking through those things. And so that's why we need people that can say, hey, like, that's not the case. People are different here. Our expectations are different here. And they can bring you back to what you really truly know, which is where you are now is not where you were before. You did your due diligence. You walked into that situation knowing that these people were about doing things a certain way and it aligned philosophically with you and they're behind you, right? And I think that's the same for any coach out there, right? We've got to be able to ground ourselves in reality And if we can have other people in our corner that can do that for us, that's great. Other times it might be that we need to go for that long walk and we need to get that journal or get the journal out or whatever that is for us that helps us to self-regulate and then start to go, okay, what evidence do I have that we're going down that path? And what else do I know that's just contrary to that?
Well, I think, JP, in my case, I benefited from both. It was both the ability to be able to share freely with my AD and talk to my team captain. And it was also the time in solitude or in reflection, thinking about forcing myself to recognize what are the differences between where you are and where you were. And one of the phrases that I would just come back to over and over as an anchor for my confidence and something that's proved to me that the pattern wasn't the same is that when it really went off the rails at Linmar, I couldn't justify anything because we weren't winning, or there wasn't this evidence that what we were doing was working. At least that was the accusation, right? And so then nothing mattered, right? Because there's no reason to justify it. And here they were 1-20 the year before we started, and then we're 500 this season. We're ranked. Like there's a clear trajectory of improvement that just it can't be denied. And so that in and of itself, and I'm not saying that just winning justifies all the things that we're doing, but that piece is clearly different from where I was 3 years ago. And so that has helped me sort of anchor myself in a lot of ways, where as soon as I start to panic a little bit, or I start to, those whispers start to come back, but we're way better off than where we were 2 years ago. The program's better off. The players are bought, and it's just a rehearsal of the evidence, as you're saying, that proves that the pattern is not repeating itself in the same way. And I'll add to that, JP, it's work. Whether it's journaling or walking or solitude, like it is work to do it because you're fighting against that inner dialogue of yourself, but it's definitely worth the effort.
And Nate is definitely right that it takes work, and sometimes we need help in that work. For instance, if you sustained a physical injury, like a torn ligament, a strained muscle, a fracture, or you're just struggling with severe back pain, you might go see a doctor, you might see a physical therapist or a chiropractor or even just a massage therapist to help you heal. But yet for some reason, we often don't think about it this way when it comes to our mental health. Now, for me personally, my mental and emotional health as of January 2023, it's as good as it's ever been. Yet I have recognized within myself that still some things still trigger my fight or flight response, primarily the fight response at home with my family, right? Things that I don't fully understand the cause or the reason about why I'm getting upset. Now, I have approached this issue just like I approached, physical issues as an ultra runner in the last year. Like last year when I got knee pain, before I went to the physio, I troubleshooted by getting new shoes, spending more time stretching, working on my running form. When I struggled with cramping, I stretched more. I studied the impact of my heart rate on cramping and made adjustments to my pacing, and I adjusted my diet and hydration. Because these ailments were hurting me, they were hurting my potential as a runner. But some ailments, they need the help of others. And so recently, I started seeing a CBT therapist for these mental triggers that I have not been able to overcome with mindfulness, journaling, solitude, exercise, and sleeping more. And I've recognized that I do not want to continue to allow past hurts in my life to continue this cycle of hurt. Because when I am triggered and I get upset, it hurts. It hurts myself emotionally and has the potential to pass on hurt to others in my life that I care about. So I share this for you as coaches. If you've got things that you are struggling to work through, consider reaching out for help. In 2016, for me as a coach, it was hiring a mentor and a coach. More recently, it's booking in with a therapist to help me better understand what's going on with some of these triggers and to give me some tools to work through these things. All right, that's it for today's episode. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your coaching stories. Shoot us an email at jpnerbun, Nerbun, at tocculture.com. Also, if you are interested in our one-on-one coaching program, you can inquire at tocculture.com. Thanks for listening in. Be sure to subscribe and keep listening. We've got some phenomenal guest episodes coming up.